Welcome back to the channel, or welcome to the channel. My name's Ben, and today we're going to be doing a comparison of these two machines. Having recently bought the new 16-inch MacBook Pro, which you can see an unboxing of by clicking up here, I thought it'd be a good idea to do some benchmarking comparisons to some other Macs. Today we're going to be doing the first of those, and this is the 13-inch MacBook Pro with an M2 chip versus the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M3 Pro chip. The benchmarks we're going to be running through are Geekbench 6, Blackmagic Disk Speed Test, Passmark Performance Test, and Cinebench 2024. I chose these because I feel like it will give us a good overall idea of the performance of these machines, but before we go through any of those benchmarks, let's take a look at the specs of each chip. First of all, we have the M2, which has an 8-core CPU with 4 performance cores, 4 efficiency cores, a 10-core GPU, and 8GB of unified memory. And the M3 Pro is a 12-core CPU with 6 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores, an 18-core GPU, and 18GB of unified memory. Now, in addition to the differences in the chips themselves, of course there are some hardware differences with the machines, with the 16-inch having a much larger and more effective cooling system. In addition to this, with the difference in process nodes, so with the M2 being on the 5nm and the M3 being on the 3nm process, we would expect more performance and for the chip to run a little bit cooler as well. Anyway, let's get into it. Geekbench 6. Geekbench 6 is a very well known and free to use benchmarking tool. It's been around for a very long time, but was recently updated to Geekbench 6, which changed some of those benchmarks. Anyway, we'll kick it off with the M2. And you can see here this took 4 minutes and 36 seconds to run. Of course, we'll go through the numbers with you in a second. And now let's take a look at the 16-inch MacBook Pro. Now, as well as the increased core count, this chip is also clocked a bit higher at 4.05 GHz, so we would expect there to be a performance increase. Now, this isn't just to compare the chips themselves, this is more so about the machines. This one taking 4 minutes 8 seconds to complete. And you can see based on the graphs here, a considerable increase in performance for the multi-core. Not so much for the single core, but definitely an increase on the multi-core. There are of course some workloads that will take advantage of the single core performance, but not all. Onto the GPU for Geekbench 6. Now we have two different GPU benchmarks that we're going to be running here, OpenCL and Metal, but we're going to kick it off with Metal to start with. We'll start that off with the M2 chip, which has a 10-core GPU. Now of course this isn't as many as the MacBook Pro 16-inch, but we do need to remember that this is still going to be better than a lot of other GPUs and especially integrated graphics. So this test took 1 minute and 9 seconds to run, and we ended up with a score of 38,094. We'll see how that compares shortly. But let's get going with the OpenCL test and see how that compares. Now, with Metal being Apple's native rendering machine, I would expect there to be more performance with that. But with the OpenCL, this took a total of 1 minute and 9 seconds to run, which was identical to the previous benchmark. However, with this, we got a score of 26,979. Let's see how those scores increase, going from the 13-inch to the 16-inch MacBook Pro, with the increase in GPU cores from 10 to 18, but also the generational increase from the M2 to the M3 chip. This test ran in 1 minute and 1 second, and that is running on the Metal GPU, and we came in with a score of 76,919. Let's now compare that to the OpenCL score. Again, expecting a slight decrease in the scoring because it's running on OpenCL, so it's not native. But as we know with Rosetta, Apple are pretty good at translation layers. This test also finished in 1 minute and 1 second, so identical to the previous, but we ended up with a score of 49,790. So comparing those results, we can see about double the performance on the M3 Pro chip compared to the M2, showing that it's not just all about the core counts. Let's move on to the Blackmagic Disk Speed Test. I feel like this is a really important test because Apple have gone through quite a lot of controversy with their SSDs in the past. We're running this test for 1 minute to make sure we get an accurate reading for prolonged performance rather than just those quick bursts. Let's move on to the 16-inch. Again, running this test for a minute, but we can already see a huge improvement in the speeds that we're getting from this machine. So let's go ahead and see how that compares to the 13-inch. Now this just shows that Apple are actually listening to their consumers, like when they brought the ports back on the MacBook Pro, but we can see some massive performance increases here with the 16-inch SSD. Let's move on to the Passmark performance test. Now I haven't seen anyone else running this benchmark when watching reviews of MacBooks in the past, and this will give us two figures, both for the CPU and memory. The CPU benchmark took 1 minute and 4 seconds to run, so we'll move on now and run the memory benchmark, and we'll be going through and comparing the figures to the 16-inch shortly. Now finishing up at 1 minute 26, we can see some of the figures there, so of course pause the video if you're interested, but let's just go ahead and get that started on the 16-inch MacBook Pro. So kicking off with the CPU benchmark, by the time this is finished running, it also finishes in 1 minute and 4 seconds, meaning I don't think we can take the time as a performance factor, but of course we've got the figures on the screen there. And running the memory benchmark, we'll see how that compares, but this also finished running in 1 minute and 26 seconds. Let's now compare that to the 13-inch MacBook Pro with the M2 chip. So the M3 Pro got just over 10,000 more points on the CPU mark, and we can also see a nice increase on the memory, which should make the machine a little bit snappier day to day. Now let's take a look at Cinebench 2024. So we will be running tests on both the CPU and GPU, and with the CPU we'll be running both the single core and the multi-core. Kicking it off with the M2, let's run the multi-core, and this is a 10-minute stress test, but it did end up running for longer because the render had finished before the 10-minute timer was up. So you can see it ran for 19 minutes and 46 seconds, and we ended up with a score of 564 points. So I'll have a quick scroll through here and you can just have a look and see how it compares to a couple of other chips, including Apple, Intel and AMD. So let's move on to the single core. And again, this test did run for a little bit longer than 10 minutes because the render was up before the timer. So in total, this rendered for 14 minutes and 49 seconds. We ended up with a score of 119 points. And I was going to move on to the GPU benchmark at this point, but for some reason it was greyed out and wouldn't let me run it. But let's move on to the 16-inch and see how we fare with Cinebench on that machine. Again, we'll be running both the CPU and GPU performance tests here, but with Cinebench, the amount of time the render takes to finish is actually an indicator of the performance, so we'll see how the M3 Pro compares. Now I have sped this footage up, which is why I've added the timers in, and we can see here this finished in 10 minutes and 49 seconds, so a little bit quicker. And we ended up with a total score of 1,032 points. And we can see by the results list on the left hand side that this is actually beating out the Apple M1 Max chip, which I think is pretty impressive. That finished on a score of 791. So it just goes to show what those generational performance increases can bring. Let's go ahead and get the single core started. And don't worry, we will be going through all these figures at the end as well. This test finished in 12 minutes and 34 seconds. So again, quicker than the M2. And it finished with a total of 139 points. Now you might have spotted that this has actually beaten out the Apple M1 Ultra chip, but remember that this is single core and the Ultra is still going to dominate with the multi-core performance. Let's move on to the GPU. Now as I said before, I didn't have the ability to run the GPU benchmark on the M2 Pro, so we're just running it on the M3 Pro here. This test finished running in 13 minutes and 48 seconds, and you can see in the results pane on the left hand side that it finishes just behind the Apple M1 Ultra, which has a 64 core GPU. So considering this is only 18 cores, that's where the real performance is coming from this generation around. Let's now go over those results and see how it compares. So we can see with the multi-core, we're getting double the performance. Single core, we're about the same, and we couldn't run the GPU test on the MacBook Pro M2, so we've only got the 16-inch result there. So as we can see, there's quite a big performance difference between the two machines, but there's also quite a big price difference. At launch, the M2 Pro was $1349, with the 16-inch costing $2599. So twice the price, but in some of those tests, we did get twice the performance as well. When we averaged those scores out, we did get over 76% increase in performance, and that is excluding the GPU results from Cinebench, as we couldn't run that on the 13-inch M2. I've got a couple more of these videos planned, comparing it to a MacBook Air 13-inch with the M1 chip, and a MacBook Pro 14-inch with the M2 Pro chip. So if you want to see any of those videos, make sure you hit that subscribe button. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like, and let me know your thoughts, or if you've got any questions in the comments below. Anyway, that's me for now. I'll leave you with some graphs at the end if you want to just go back over that performance. But thank you ever so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.